So good evening, and welcome to tonight's conversation on the Retreat of Western Liberalism with Ed Luce, the chief U.S. columnist for the Financial Times, and Mark Blyth, the Eastman professor of political economy here at Brown. I'm Susan Moffett, the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy here at the Watson Institute. I'm just delighted to see all of you here today. Welcome all. So I invited Ed to join us tonight because the Taubman Center takes the perspective that to understand current American politics and policy, we really need to examine the United States from a global perspective and from a historical perspective. And Ed does both of these things in his book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism. He writes towards the end of his first chapter, the crisis in the West is real, structural, and likely to persist. Some of what ails the West is within our power to fix, but doing so means understanding exactly how we got here. It would also require a conscious effort to look at the world from unfamiliar standpoints and admit that the West has no monopoly on truth or virtue. I look forward to talking with you about these points tonight and many others. So our time tonight will be organized in the following way. We'll start with some comments from Ed for about 20 minutes or so, and then Mark Blyth will chime in with some questions for about another 15 minutes. And then we'll open up the floor to your questions. So we are a full house tonight, which is great, but I would invite us all to be mindful of our air time. Please ask one direct question and share the air with your colleagues. We will wrap up around 6:30, and then I hope you'll join us in the foyer of the Watson Institute for a book signing and reception with Ed Luce. But now will you please join me in welcoming Ed Luce from the Financial Times.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's a delight to meet you and to be here at the Watson Institute and at Brown, which I always love visiting, and also to be here with Mark. I've known and admired Mark's work for a long time, but we've only actually met once, although it feels like many more than that. And I think the one or two martinis we had is probably something to do with that, the memorability of that evening. So it's a real delight to be here with Mark and to accept this invitation. Yes, my talk will have some bleak elements, but it won't be quite that. Won't be quite that dramatic. I will pay attention to the time and keep this to 20 minutes or so. So the last book I wrote was about 5 years ago, and it was called Time to Start Thinking: America and the Spectre of Decline. And it was a fairly hard-hitting book. Some would call it pessimistic, I'd call it realistic, naturally. And the New York Times reviewed Time to Start Thinking and otherwise very positively said it ought to be renamed Time to Start Drinking. And my sort of retort was, if this had been about Britain at that time, I might have entitled it Time to Start Sniffing Glue, because Britain was also facing a bleak outlook. And I think the reason I'm mentioning this point is because people don't like hearing bleak prognoses, and I'm afraid I've now twice consecutively delivered bleak prognoses, but also I believe that people, even after all that's happened the last 15 months since Brexit, up to the German election yesterday, remain complacent, particularly amongst, if you'll forgive my shorthand, the more fortunate elites in our societies, of which the august audience here is definitely a part. So in 2012, when my last book came out, Obama was facing his re-election campaign. It looked like he was going to win. America had recovered, spent three and a half years recovering from the Great Recession of 2008. And it looked like when Obama talked about, as he did later, the Republican fever being likely to break, as he did after he won re-election, that he might be right, that the kinds of things most of us can probably agree on, such as comprehensive immigration reform and infrastructure spending and more updated 21st century policies for training of the workforce. Those kinds of things might be possible in 2013, 2014. And the reason why I stuck to a slightly bleaker prognosis of what American democracy was likely to deliver in practice is because of the larger background situation, and that's to do with, first and foremost, the middle class. So the late American scholar Barrington Moore said, "No bourgeoisie, no democracy." And in that simple phrase, I think there's a lot of truth. When you have a strong middle, as most of our democracies, in particular the United States, had for most of the post-war decades, then you tend to have a pretty robust democracy. And when you have a weak middle, you tend to have a more polarized democracy. And so I don't think there ought to be any surprise with what we're all experiencing, because we do have a weaker middle class than we used to. I'm not going to reprise the data you're all familiar with about median income, stagnation, declining income mobility, and rising inequality. Those three, what I call the triple cocktail, that has been affecting the middle and beyond in our economies. What really sort of grabbed me in 2016 and does so, and did in 2012 too, and does so today, is the self-perception and the self-identification surveys that are done of Americans and people in other democracies. And America's, I think, the most interesting. Gallup has been asking this question for years and years. Do you define yourself as lower class, middle class, or upper middle class? And at the turn of the century, 31% of Americans described themselves as lower class. And that number, by 2016, had shot up to 49%. And that's a big leap. And now, since then, it's actually improved somewhat. It's gone down to 44, 45. But it's in a country that defines itself as middle class, where really to be American is to be middle class. I think that's a flashing red signal that's been there for a long time. So let me get to 2016 and what happened last year. Some of you might remember the famous and much deservedly celebrated New Yorker sketch writer Andy Borowitz, writing an immortal headline on the night of, or the morning of 24th of June, when the Brexit result had become known. And he said, "Britons lose long-cherished right to look down on Americans as dumber than they are." And then, of course, as you know, in November, America leveled the playing field. And I'm going to get on to that in a moment. But in terms of the complacency that I started out warning you about and saying I think it should be a deeper concern than it is, let's talk about what's happened since Trump's election, since the two bombshells of 2016, because a narrative has developed amongst people across the spectrum, but particularly, in the media and in academia, that the populist wave basically peaked with Trump and Brexit, and that there are particular problems with the English-speaking, the largest English-speaking democracies, that aren't available or aren't so evident elsewhere. And I think that's just plain wrong. So the first election since after the Trump victory was in Austria, the presidential election there, where the Green Party candidate defeated the Freedom Party candidate, Norbert Hofer. And the Freedom Party is essentially sort of postmodern neo-Nazi, by 54 to 46%, a really disturbingly narrow victory that many people celebrated as, well, the tide is being turned, an extremist has lost. Then we get this spring to the Dutch election, where Geert Wilders' extremist party, the Freedom Party of the Netherlands, came second place rather than first place, as some polls had indicated, and therefore underperformed. And again, that was celebrated as a bullet dodged, which of course it was. It would have been way worse if he'd won. But one of the reasons he lost is that Mark Rutte's government, who were re-elected, had stolen many of the clothes that Geert Wilders' party the anti-immigration, the anti-multicultural clothes that he stands for. Then we get to France in early May. The least bad, what I call the sort of glass of champagne half full result, in that Macron did win, and he won quite comprehensively. But, of course, a neo-fascist, I think we should call things by their name. Terms like openly nationalist are used, or hard right, but I think if you look at the antecedents and the membership of the Front National, it is a neo-fascist party. Got 34% of the vote. Now, many of you would be too young to remember the 2002 French presidential election, when her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, also got into the second round, and it prompted a crisis of the French Republic. It was an absolute funeral march between the first round and the second round, because a fascist had made it through onto the final ballot. An absolute crisis of the Republic. Now, he lost the final ballot with only 18, I say only, but with 18% of the vote. Communists, socialists, everybody else on the political spectrum put the proverbial clothes peg on their nose to vote for Jacques Chirac, the Gaullist, the centre-right president. In 2017, when his daughter makes it to the second round, it's actually quite normal. It's not a crisis of the Republic. So again, glass of champagne half full, but no time to be popping champagne. And then we get to yesterday's result in Germany, the least bad of all the results that I've just listed. Fewer than 1 in 7 of the German electorate voted for the far-right party. You can debate whether we call it neo-Nazi or not, and I don't want to get swallowed into the rabbit hole of semantics. It is an extremist party. I see even the Guardian newspaper refers to it as openly nationalist. I think that's, from the Guardian, a very euphemistic description. It is an extremist party. It is the first time in Germany's post-war history that a far-right party has got representation in the Bundestag with 13% of the vote, way above the 5% threshold. Nothing like this has been seen since 1945 in German politics. And it's now got 94 seats. It's the third largest party in the German parliament. It is nevertheless the least bad result of all the results I've just listed for you. And I am including Brexit, of course, and Trump's victory in that list. Why is Germany less prone to extremism than other countries? And I think this is a really interesting question, to which there are 2 or 3 answers. The first is the very obvious answer, that it has understood its history very, very well. Germany celebrates boringness in its politics and understands the virtue of boringness in its politics. In fact, the Christian Democrats, Angela Merkel's party, a few elections ago, had the election-winning slogan, and when it swept them to power, no experiments. That was it. So, don't worry, we're not going to try anything new. And they won. Only in Germany. Germany has a very, very deeply ingrained, and I think quite responsible, civic education system about politics that we are lacking here in the United States and in Britain and in other countries. And it fears the voice of the majority, and it has lots of inbuilt. So that's one reason. I think another reason is that Germany has middle classes that express less dissatisfaction than across most Western countries. And I think this is a really important point that gets lost sometimes when we dwell on the first point about the uniqueness of Germany's political history. The German middle class, in Germany, they don't make the mistake we make. I think in the United States and Britain in particular, but in other countries too, of confusing having a college degree with being skilled, or confusing not having a college degree with being unskilled. The German vocational system is organized very differently, and you can do the kinds of service sector jobs in Germany that we would consider to be nonsense jobs that are unpaid and that are simply stepping stones, very quickly stepped on to other more respectable jobs. You can be a flower arranger in Germany with 3-4 years training and get paid well for it and be respected for it. In 2008, when I think what we wrongly called the global recession began, and I point out in my book it was an Atlantic recession, not a global recession. The German system responded very differently, and the Scandinavians to some extent too than we did. Namely, they offered reduced hours to their workforces, to their employees. In exchange for lower wages, they would not lose their job. And I think that was emblematic of a very different relationship, not just between employer and employee, but in terms of the value of the workforce. Of course, you're incentivized to invest in the skills and the training of somebody you employ if they're going to stick around. And you're likelier to stick around if you're not laid off, if you're not treated as an accounting item when the economy shrinks. So I think that is a very important overlooked factor. The German result is nevertheless deeply disturbing. It is worth pointing out that the AfD did much, much better in the former East Germany, where it got close to 20% in some of the land, than it did in what was known as former West Germany. And East Germany did not have the post-war German education system that took responsibility for Nazism. East Germany blamed everybody else, including the West. Austria does too, incidentally. Austria presents itself as a victim of Nazism and not a collaborator. It's also the most deindustrialized part of Germany. So that's what's happened since the sort of double bombshells of Brexit. The debate, Brexit and Trump, the debate over why is very important, and I'm not going to. I can talk for a long time about this, so I'm going to keep an eye on. I'm going to keep an eye on the clock. But the debate on why has, I think, sort of bifurcated into either its economic reasons or it's for what pollsters, what Gallup and others rather euphemistically call cultural anxiety, by which, of course, they mean racism and other associated pathologies. And I think it's worth pointing out, very clearly, that there are no economic extenuating circumstances for racism, misogyny, homophobia, or any other of these scapegoating prejudices. That is a moral point. That is a moral absolute, and therefore admits of no qualification. The point I wish to sort of put across is an analytical one about the backdrop to what's happening in our democracies. And I think there is no getting away from the economic pessimism of middle-class Americans and non-Americans, Europeans of all colours, in explaining what we're going through. And I think not to do so, to simply attribute it all to deplorability, is not just a tactical mistake, it's an analytical error as well. And I make that distinction between the moral and the analytical because it's easy to misunderstand. In these very charged times, it's easy to elide one into the other. A lot of us date, I think wrongly, the problems with the American middle classes and the Western middle classes to the 2008 recession. That, of course, I think was a very dramatically economically upsetting event. But the numbers and the experience of middle class decline stretches way back, way before then. The 2002-2007 business expansion here in George W. Bush's presidency was the first on record, since the Great Depression, where the median household income was lower at the end of it than at the beginning of it. And of course the economy was something like 15 to 20% larger at the end of it. But the share taken by the middle classes wasn't just smaller relatively, it had shrunk absolutely. If you look at male median earnings, they've been essentially stagnant since the late 1970s. If you look at median household earnings, they've gone up about a fifth or so in real terms since the late 1970s. That is principally because a lot of women have joined the labour force since the late 1970s. A big surge in female labour force participation in the 80s and the 90s, which has levelled off since then. But women have been paid less well, and therefore median household income hasn't doubled. Often, way more often than the male. In the case of two-earner households, they're in multiple part-time jobs rather than in full-time jobs. And so that number, the median household income number, is not as good as it looks, and it's not that good. Similar statistics, to one degree or another, are available for pretty much any Western democracy, and those degrees do vary quite a bit. They do vary quite a bit. In Germany, it does look less bleak. Scandinavia, it looks less bleak, and elsewhere. What about cultural anxiety? What role has that played? Well, if you ask why Angela Merkel didn't do as well yesterday as she was expected to do, then I think that the fact that 1 million refugees were allowed into the country is a huge explanatory factor. That's clearly a major piece of the explanation. But if you were to put that 1 million onto the American population, that would be 4 million Syrian refugees. We've taken less than 20,000. And for Britain, it would be about 800,000 Syrian refugees. Britain has taken 6,000. So I think, relative to that extraordinary intake, an extraordinary moral gesture from Angela Merkel, yesterday's result wasn't so bad, and doesn't really explain what we're going through in Britain and the United States. There are a good many sources I could cite, but I want to go straight to one, and that is Hillary Clinton's memoir. I don't know whether any of you have read What Happened. It's only been out, 10 days or so. As an FT reviewer, I was asked to review it, so I sat down and read it in 8 hours, and to my very pleasant surprise, enjoyed reading it and found it well written. I say pleasant surprise because I'd read Living History, and as Mark and I were discussing, I felt that was sort of living dead in prose terms. And I'd read Hard Choices, which was very hard reading. This is good reading, because she's not running again, and therefore she's a kind of Hillary unleashed. And she does a very, very good analytical job of asking why it was she lost the last election. And there are any number of possible things you can point to. James Comey's intervention shortly before the election is clearly one of them. If you look at early voting that took place before Comey delivered that bombshell, it was at far higher margins for Hillary than voting that took place on polling day itself. Clearly that had an impact. Voter suppression in states like Wisconsin, which Hillary really should have won, and Ohio, which has 2 million fewer voters than it used to have, mostly non-white. That's clearly another potential culprit. Hillary making the tactical error of calling half of Trump's voters a basket of deplorables. I'm old-fashioned, and I think she kind of admits she is. You should ask people for their vote. You shouldn't say you don't need their vote or don't want their vote. And so that was a tactical error. Tactical honesty of actually being correct that many of his voters are deplorable is another possible reason. And you can go on, and the economic backdrop she gets into too. But the more you go through what is a very, very, I think, comprehensive and fairly honest accounting for why she lost, the more it reminded me of Agatha Christie's murder on the Orient Express. There are a lot of fingerprints on this dagger handle, which was the fingerprint that first plunged the dagger into the corpse of Hillary's campaign. I don't know. And to some degree, I don't really care. I think the question that we ought to be asking ourselves is why, win or lose, Donald Trump could have got within spitting distance of the presidency in the first place. And I don't believe it's possible to get an answer to that question without understanding the rise of economic anxiety and anti-establishment feelings, not just on the right, but on the left in the United States. And we don't forget, but we do well to remind ourselves that the Bernie Sanders campaign very, very nearly took the Democratic nomination without any of the advantages Donald Trump had. Bernie Sanders isn't a billionaire. You've got super delegates in the Democratic Party, unlike the Republican system, and he wasn't a household name. So I'm going to finish with a final point that has nothing to do with the economic causes of what we're going through, and that's technology and politics. And stop me if I've gone on too long. I'll make it a very pithy final point. That is that the business of campaigning and winning elections is getting easier and easier. Technology is enabling all kinds of extraordinary ways of finding voters. This very same technology is making it harder and harder to govern. And that gap between the expertise and skill that technology is enabling in campaigning and in appealing with different messages to different people who aren't even aware of that sort of inconsistency, and winning office on the micro-targeting precision of technology, that gap between getting to office and being essentially disabled once you're in office, even if you're a competent president, which I don't believe Trump is anywhere near to being, it is, I think, a large part of what's ailing our democracies. And it's nothing to do with the decline or the travails of the middle class. It's to do with whether we are resilient enough as electorates to deal with the bombardment of information and marketing and advertising, political, subliminal, overt, and the metastasizing of this that is going to be happening in the years ahead, whether we're able to filter this. And this is why I do mention Germany. The civic education, civics in schools, is a very, very important response to this problem. We tend to sort of declare war on supply, like we did with drugs. And, you know, we can shut down RT, we could block Sputnik, we'd be breaking the First Amendment, we'd be breaking our own principles, but we can't shut down the demand, and the demand is the problem. Final point, because I have overdone my time, but Barney Frank, who those of you who aren't old enough, was one of my favorite congressmen in Massachusetts. One of the first, I think, to come out as gay, first congressman, but one of the top intellects on Capitol Hill. When being asked why Congress has such low approval ratings, made the immortal comment, look, everybody hates Washington, everybody hates the media, everybody hates Congress, but let me tell you, voters are no picnic either. And I think unless we think more broadly about how we respond as electorates, the technology problem is going to get worse. So on that not particularly encouraging point, but levelling point, and Mark, over to you, and if you don't mind, I'll sit for this bit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we only have a short session today. Unfortunately, we can't just go on, and to keep us on time, just giving everyone a heads up, there is a class here. This class has read Ed's book. When I stop twittering on, the majority of question time is going to be given to the students in this class. So you just get a heads up on that. All right, here we go. First one. You didn't really talk about the book. I understand why. You probably presented it 27 times. You're bored. You want to keep up with it. So you've given us, more of where we are now. And I'm glad you spoke about the German election. I too think it's very important. There's a lot of data in there. But I want to go with the title of the book. You call it The Retreat of Western Liberalism. And I've always thought, since I read the book, I thought, is it really a retreat or is it just desserts? Because in a sense, we've been on this crusade to basically say that inequality doesn't matter. There's always been inequality. That we can basically allow Western wages to basically find an equilibrium with Asian wages and not worry about this. That we don't really need nation or class or other identities because we're all just like postmodern consuming subjects with very specific little identities. And that's the type of imaginary that, in a sense, neoliberalism has created. So to what extent are you mapping a retreat or sort of like a Pyrrhic victory?
That's a really good question. I don't have a simple answer to it. Retreat, of course, can either be forced or tactical. You can have voluntary retreats. I did have a battle with my publisher, which thankfully I won. They wanted to call it the collapse of Western liberalism, and I think it's premature to call
Reports
that,
of my death and all that sort of stuff.
greatly
Right, yes.
exaggerated. And so and I'm not predicting the collapse either of Western liberalism. Your question is a good one. The America-British problem is clearly worse than the Canada problem, to pick another large English-speaking democracy. And I do think a lot of that has to do with the fact that public spending as a share of GDP is higher, considerably higher in Canada than it is in the United States. I think it's about on a par with Britain, but I think it's better spent. So I think that the neoliberal dimension that you're talking about is perhaps less prevalent there, and that might explain some of the sort of rather impressive boringness of Canadian politics, although, in the era of Justin Trudeau, it's not that boring. The larger sort of idea, and I do go into this to some extent, that we've got a sort of reverse Marxian situation where it's the wealthy who have no nation. And it's increasingly the left behinds who cling to the flag, unfortunate word, but who express nationalistic feelings, is, I think, a real problem. And I know that there are plenty of wealthy people. Peter Thiel is a really good example. And he, of course, spoke at Trump's, I was there in Cleveland, he spoke at Trump's convention. And he said it's a contest between capitalism and democracy. We'll go for capitalism every time. And Trump kind of suits people with that agenda. So I think you're asking the right question. I'm sorry I don't have a more pithy answer.
All right, well, let me go back on this one and say, well, I'm going to reject everything that you say, you're a pessimist, etc., for one simple thing, and it was said by someone in the financial crisis, I can't remember exactly who it was, that the United States has one thing going for it. It's the most attractive horse in the glue factory. And in the last part of your book, Fallout, you talk about basically the United States basically its position of hegemonic power falls apart and the whole world being worse off for that. But is it really on the rocks? I mean, think about, for example, you got the example of Germany, European welfare states, they're more secure. Not quite buying that one. You know as well as I do, the euro might not be there in 5 years. All you need is one Italian referendum and the whole thing goes. As for China, try buying their debt. You can't do it very easily, unless you're doing dim sum bonds through Hong Kong. Do you really trust them to make their promises in areas such as intellectual copyright, property rights, et cetera, So lacking other half-decent alternatives, isn't it the case that no matter how bad we get, the United States is still going to end up running the show?
I think no matter how bad we get, nobody's going to replace the United States, but that's slightly different to what your question is implying. I don't fear China is going to supplant America as the hegemon. I fear chaos is. And I think, as the cliche goes, nature abhors a vacuum. The most dangerous and lethal time in human history was the interwar period where Britain was no longer able to be a hegemon and the United States was reluctant to step in. I fear that situation more. It's I don't think the euro is necessarily going to fail, but even if it survives, Europe is not going to, particularly after yesterday, with a much weakened Merkel, is not going to step into America's shoes. I don't think China could possibly have the global network of alliances that enables a fully functioning Pax Americana to do so. That's not going to happen. But will America support the systems of global public goods that it has been supplying for the last 7 decades? It's not just Donald Trump who doesn't want to. It's also the left of the Democratic Party that doesn't want to. So I'm not optimistic about America's willingness to sustain its role, and it is in the context of declining relative American power. Right. That is happening.
So I'll just chuck one more and then we'll open up the questions. So the sort of the nightmare one that goes on from where you start and where you end up on your analysis is, and you ain't seen nothing yet, by which I mean the digital technological revolution, which is just coming on stream now, is going to be so disruptive of labour markets that all of the issues that you've highlighted, to shrinking middle class, declining income share, expensive stuff becoming super expensive, college educations, for example, blah, blah, blah. And it's becoming very skewed and polarizing. And right in the middle of that, we're going to chuck disruptive technologies. Now, one of the lines in your book, which just blew me away, more people drive things in this country than make things. So what happens when you do autonomous vehicles? Right, you're going to catastrophically transform those labour markets. Now, I don't believe that's true. And the reason is a kind of cognitive survivor bias. Every time there's been a major technological revolution, and we've had basically 4 of them over 200-300 years of capitalism, labour markets have got bigger rather than smaller. Because what happens is we remember all the jobs that have disappeared, but we're unable to predict the jobs that will show up. So if it's possible that this time might not be any different, can you imagine a world in which the Peter Thiels of this world actually do emerge as our unlikely saviours, or is that complete horseshit?
I can imagine that world, and it's not complete horseshit. Look, the sort of backdrop to this, and why I'm not pessimistic, is that the rise of others, something like 300,000 people are getting electricity a day around the world that didn't ever have electricity, and similar numbers for clean drinking water. We are living in the midst of the most extraordinary era of abundance in human history and the most rapid retreat of absolute poverty in human history. There is an extremely disruptive technological revolution going on, which we're in the early stages of, but which is creating another kind of superabundance. The problem is not our material resources. The problem is our political ability to cope with the disruptions of that transition. Because with every change, there are winners and losers. And the losers, tend to be, they know who they are, and their losses tend to be absolute. The winners tend to be, spread much thinner, and they don't speak so loudly. And we live in vetocracies now, where the losers can basically stop stuff from happening. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. There are 15.5 million people working in the retail sector. These are not jobs we should be fighting to defend. And indeed, Donald Trump isn't. I mean, he's trying to defend the 77,000 jobs in the coal mining sector for some reason. But they are going to lose their jobs, a lot of them. Some of them will get way better jobs as sort of logistics managers and data optimizers for Amazon. But most of them won't. The question is, can we carry the others over and through to the different kinds of jobs that we can't anticipate that will be arising? And that's a political question. It's not about resources. I don't think we have a resource problem. I think we have a politics problem. And you tell me how that's going to go away.
Yeah. Just as one thought in closing before I'll open it up. So I'm writing a book with a guy called Eric Lonergan, and the way that we try and think about this is a concept in finance called optionality. So basically, you can write an option on something, you pay a fee, and you're buying insurance. Now, in order to do that, it helps if you have cash resources, etc. So people in the top 5, 10% or above have optionality on the world. In a sense, I don't need to have an identity. I've got 2 passports. My daughter has 3 passports. Right, I have optionality on the globe. I'm a well-paid tenured professor. You get the picture. But what happens to everyone else? They have negative optionality. Their losses are absolute. Now, if you have to design a political system to address that, what you want to do is essentially spread optionality across the population. Why is it, in your opinion, from all the people you spoke to in Washington, D.C., that they seem to be so unable to even conceptualize that as the problem?
First of all, that sounds like a brilliant concept. I will read that book.
Plug.
Second, look, there are a lot of brilliant people in Washington. There's no shortage of IQ. People in my profession tend to, because of the nature of journalism, not through their own elective choice, treat politics as a horse race. And you cover campaigns rather than where politicians are campaigning. You cover voters at rallies. To the extent you interact with real people, it's at a rally. And so I think there is a problem with journalism. And of course, if you're on the plane with one candidate, you have a kind of conflict of interest there, because if that candidate wins, you become White House correspondent. That means you're going to do really well. So you have a kind of pro-candidate. There are a lot of people who are interested in these problems in Washington at think tanks, but nobody's really listening to them. Whole sort of sections of the Amazon sort of disappear for Brookings' sort of output of its policy papers. I don't think that Washington is uninterested in this subject. I think that people who are elected in Washington are disincentivized to be interested in what Washington produces. Because it does produce a lot of good stuff, and so does Academia Brown. People like you come up with brilliant stuff. But even the wonkiest wonks nowadays on Capitol Hill, let's take Paul Ryan, have stopped consulting the American Enterprise Institute, for example. There is just no return to intelligent policy. So again, I sort of go back to Barney Frank's statement about the voters being no picnic.
Fair enough. All right, now I'm going to open it up to the students in this class. There we go. So here's the first question for Ed. Don't disappoint. Come on. You got prime seating. You've all read the book. Excellent. Down the front.
Sure. My question for you is kind of about the future of Trump. I've heard a lot of different controversy about what's going to happen with Trump's reelection, if not it's going to happen. And, you know, I don't think that there's a way to give a definitive answer. I don't really think that that's helpful. I think instead it would be more helpful to think about different trends that we could look at to see whether or not we're going to repeat what happened in the last election. And I was wondering if you could kind of give me any insight into what you think might happen based on the trends we're experiencing now.
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know what, as your question implies, I don't know the answer. And actually, Mark and I were just chatting before. Ladbrokes, the British booking agency, which, along with Paddy Power, is one of the most liquid American political futures markets, puts a 50% chance that Trump will be impeached. But it also has a 50% chance that he will serve out 2 full terms. So as Mark pointed out, this is spread betting. People don't know what's going to happen. I think the Supreme Court is hearing a case about political district boundary drawing. And if it basically strikes hard against gerrymandering, I have to say I'm not confident with this Supreme Court that it will. That will answer some of the problem. If it doesn't, we're going to get a continuation of politicians appealing to their bases, of fearing primary more than they fear defeat to the other party in a general election. Until that changes, both at the district and the state and the Senate level, I don't think people like Paul Ryan are going to be consulting policy analysts. I think they're going to be looking over their own shoulder. Tomorrow in Alabama, as you know, there's a primary challenge to the sitting Senator Luther Strange. Strangely enough, Trump has endorsed Luther Strange, even though the sort of Trumpian figure there, Roy Moore, is challenging him. Steve Bannon is behind Roy Moore. And Bannon is testing his theory that actually the base believes in the issues. And Trump is testing his theory, no, they believe in me as their cult personality. And so I think tomorrow is going to answer a lot of questions. I think it's no accident Trump started this NFL, this really ghastly NFL kneeling controversy at the rally in Huntsville, Alabama on Friday night. This is a way of whipping the base into a racialized frenzy. It's not really a good answer, but it's, I think, the most sort of kinetic political one that you should be monitoring.
Next question. If you don't ask questions, you'll all get downgraded.
There's a man with his hand up
There
there.
we go.
Hi. Do you suspect it'll be more politically advantageous in the future for more mainstream parties to adopt some of the positions that the Trumps and the Front Nationals of the world have presented, or rather to present themselves as the sort of anti-Trumps, anti-neo-fascists to energize their more moderate base?
I think both. It's a very good question. Both. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Democratic leader, has been talking because Trump hasn't delivered on his more extravagant trade protectionist promises, such as imposing 45% tariff on China imports and pulling out of NAFTA immediately, that he's created a space there for the Democrats to fill. Schumer is a pretty good measure of the purely entrepreneurial politician. He's just thinking of market space. And I do believe that a lot of Democrats are moving into that space. So that some people on the Democratic Party are moving to Trump's non-social agenda because Trump isn't fulfilling it to the degree he might have. Others, sometimes the same people, are being the anti-Trump figure on social policies, and there's no inconsistency there necessarily. So I think the answer is both.
Next question. Go ahead. Gentleman here.
How do you think we can come back, or do you think we can come back, from the rejection of the intelligentsia that we've seen in both Trump's election and in Brexit, and the famous line, "The people have had enough of experts"?
Yeah, and I hasten to add, I am not an expert here. I'm a generalist and a journalist, so I don't at all associate with that. Some of my...
I'm an expert.
Some of it sounds like you, along with Mark, are a compatriot of mine. Some of my even less expertly colleagues in the British tabloid media, who are brilliant at puns and names, I think, give some indication of that. So Theresa May's flailing prime ministership, a very poisoned chalice, but she wants it, and she wants to hold on to it. So headlines: dismayed, mayhem, Mayday. I think the experts will be talking about boarding the Mayflower, were it not for the fact that it's as bad over here. I think things go in cycles that aren't necessarily to do with economics or technology. And, if you want a positive example, the re-election of Rouhani in Iran, an odd positive example, the strength of feeling and organization for moderation in Iran, I think, is no accident after that clown Ahmadinejad had exhausted all clownishness. And Berlusconi's not so popular in Italy anymore. So, I think, there are natural human cycles that are independent of anything I've been talking about, where the pantomime just plays itself out. But goodness knows what damage it does in the meantime, particularly if it's in the superpower.
Just to build on that for a minute, because I just want to jump in. But this is sort of Nassim Taleb's critique of this as well, which is, is totally right, which is when you have this highly skewed income and wealth distribution, the people who are the experts who make the decisions and tell everyone is good for them, try and nudge them into better behaviours, but God forbid they ever went to my school, that sort of stuff, right? They don't have any skin in the game, so they can do Iraq, they can do the financial crisis, they can dump the costs on someone else, they can walk away and expect a promotion, right? Back in the day, in the classical republics, if you did that sort of thing, you would die, right? Game of Thrones, that would be it, right? But in the modern world, there is no skin in the game and no responsibility for this. So experts are going to be discounted in that one because ultimately we don't pay a price for our mistakes. Is there any way that you can see, I'm not suggesting that, you get your policies wrong, you get flayed, right? But is there some way of it rebuilding the public trust by bringing some better measure of accountability into that type of environment?
It's a very good, very, very good question, and kind of drives to the heart of this. My idea of the spokesman, at least for the expert class, my personification of this is David Cameron, and talk about living a life with no consequences. He whistled,
in all meanings of the word.
with all meanings, whistled as he walked away from the job, just happily, whistling a tune. I'm so glad I'm out of this job, and gets, his whatever. Quite rapidly declining speaking fees, but still, pretty large speaking fees. And he's then followed by Theresa May. Now, I think I've probably answered your question, sort of given the sense that Theresa May is probably the worst Prime Minister Britain has had since David Cameron. So it's not looking good. But I think the experts, sorry, I'm so carried away with my own flippant jokes. I've forgotten the answer I was going to give to your serious question about.
Yes, exactly. Accountability. How do we build accountability?
Accountability. It's a very, very difficult question, but I do think it involves a restoration of local control over politics. I think there's been a complete gouging out of the kinetic politics that that enables people to treat the business sanely. And I think that it's no accident that media at the local level has pretty much vanished. Somebody on the op-ed page of the New York Times today made the very good point that if there were to be a Facebook tax, or if Facebook were to start thinking intelligently about taking measures that would stop the kind of taxes or regulation that it might be deservedly facing, then providing grants for local journalism to hold state capitals and cities and municipalities to account is a really, really good practical measure to restore accountability to politics and enthusiasm for it. And so, just as one fairly small thing, I think that would be a good step.
That would be fair.
Yeah.
One more from the class before we open it up. Yes, there we go. Go ahead.
I was wondering about the environment, and you're talking earlier about the power vacuum that may be created as we lose sort of the U.S. as the hegemon, and trying to think about if that's going to lead to planetary destruction or perhaps an opportunity for a more nuanced approach to global warming and measures. If Trump is losing power, but he's very anti-global warming, is it a possibility that this actually could lead to better global warming protections in the future?
Quite possibly. There are a number of totally unintended positive effects of Trump. His withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, was followed that week by visits of Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, China and India's leaders, to Europe, in which Europe, China and India agreed together, this affects us not a jot. Many American cities and governors and mayors came out with similar statements. Justin Trudeau expressed disappointment in the Canadian government's statement about the American federal government's decision. Normally you just, in the language of these communiques, statements, would just express disappointment in America's decision. But I think that there is a reaction to Trumpism that in many ways is quite positive. I'm not going to predict the future of climate change politics, but in terms of the spread and cheapening or becoming less expensive nature of alternative energy systems, the developing world now has more installed solar and wind capacity, as my paper, I think, was reporting today only, than the developed world. And it's just inconceivable, the Chinas and the Indias, who used to think about this in terms of equity and fairness, understandably, and are now thinking about it in terms of the actual challenge, namely global warming. It's inconceivable we would have seen those kinds of trends even 5 years ago. And so I think stuff's moving on anyway, and some of it, actually, Trump might be totally inadvertently spurring.
Now up to everybody else. Questions for Ed. Gentleman here.
My question is whether decline in middle-class wages is linked to people who have been lifted out of poverty in the developed world, and where the correct moral stance on that is, if those things are directly correlated.
I don't think they're directly, well, they are directly correlated. I'm not sure the causal factor is as strong as we might think, or our politics might lead us to think. Mark pointed out I didn't really synopsize my book in full, and the first sort of third of my book is about the age of convergence that we're living in, where the 85% of the world that isn't Western and that wasn't either colonized or left behind by the Industrial Revolution that took place in what we call the West, is catching up with the West. And we're maybe a third of the way through that process. And it's going to continue. But the technological aspect, I think, is arguably more important. So China is experiencing loss of manufacturing jobs. India's Narendra Modi is betting the farm on a strategy he calls Make in India, which is to follow China on it. So you have low value-added manufacturing jobs, and then you move up the value-added chain. But it's not likely to work because automation, even at Indian wage rates, is making labor-intensive production less prevalent. So, I think, as I say, there is an incredibly positive thing going on, which is what's happening to the rest and the age of convergence. But there are common challenges, whether you live in a democracy or an autocracy, whether you live in the West or whether you live in the South or the East, to do with how you equip the majority of your labor forces for these challenges. And I think that is actually almost like climate change, a universal problem.
Next question. Down the front. Here. And then over there.
You spoke a little bit on how comparative education, for example, in West Germany and Eastern Germany, was like a factor in extremist politics. What responsibility do you see in America in education, both domestically and internationally, in a long-term solution for the liberal retreat?
A large share, and training, not just education and training. I think if you're talking about K through 12, and if you're talking about civics, civics is not one of the things that are tested. It's math and English proficiency that are tested. We need to be, if we're going to stick, which I think is wrong, but to the testocracy that we're living in, we're going to need to start testing civics. It's really important. It's critically important. It's actually, I think, a strand of national security to have an electorate that is better prepared and informed than we are today. And so I do think that's a critical part of it. And I have to say, I do think that other countries do a better job of it. I don't wish to keep picking on the sort of two original sinners of 2016, but Britain and the United States. It's no accident that we're perhaps less interested in what goes on in other countries than other countries are in what goes on in other countries. And I think there is a triumphalism to Anglophone democracies, a breastbeatingness to our political cultures, an exceptionalism in America, and God knows a British Elizabethan sort of fantasy in Britain that comes from not having lost any wars, big wars in the 20th century, or been occupied, or had a revolution. There is a complacency. Nobody in living memory in our countries has gone through that, and the self-regardingness and the complacency that we feel keeps being belied, but we've got to snap out of it. This should be enough to make us snap out of it. But education's a huge, if we're looking to the future, huge dimension. So it's a very good question.
Just a little vignette on that one. When I was dating my wife, Jules, when we first met, she was living in London, and she had an apartment across from the Imperial War Museum, and they had a poster celebrating summer of 1940, and they had Spitfire Summer. So you imagine all these upper-class toffs and chalks away, chaps, all this kind of nonsense. And my wife is German, and she just stopped him and said to me, could you imagine in Germany, first of all, having something called Der Empirische Kriegsmusee, right? No, right? Just no, right? And then secondly, 60, 70 years after this event, your main cultural celebration is like Spitfires over Devon and Cornwall.
Right.
Really, it's kind of sad.
Yeah.
So, gentlemen there.
You talked previously about how cultural and economic anxieties might be playing into what's happened with Trump and other far-right movements, but I also wanted to push you on whether you think the role of dark money in elections is pushing a lot of this, because like you noted, right, a lot of these trends are pre-existing. And so arguably, right, the sudden infusion of dark money into American politics has exacerbated these in a way that might lead one to actually attribute more of the blame to them. And so I guess what would be your assessment about the efficacy of dark money in elections, and if it is efficacious, what could we do about it?
So, the First Amendment gets in the way of proper election spending regulation, or a suitably broad enough definition of what constitutes election spending. It keeps getting in the way. I personally, as a non-jurisprudential mind, do not understand why money equates to speech. I just have such difficulty getting my head around that concept. But it does, and otherwise, very independent minds, whom I would usually agree with, keep persuading me that under the American judicial system, it's very, very hard to imagine a Supreme Court upholding the kinds of spending restriction that you find commonly in other democracies. Citizens United, I think, was a huge sort of charter for billionaires, a huge charter of billionaires in 2010. And it enables basically the further disintegration of the party system, because candidates don't need their parties for money anymore. If they've got rich backers out there, then they can rely on that to fund their campaigns. And disintermediation, to use that ugly Latinate term, of party systems is what leads to people like Trump becoming nominee. We used to sort of rely on people who do this full time to filter out the the more outlandish names. But this time the human freak show, won. And I think that money and independent money is a huge, huge reason why. What we do to stop it, I'll have to sort of bat off to more schooled judicial minds than mine. I don't have a judicial background. Well, I don't have a law background.
Thank you. With that, let's take our conversation now into the main foyer of the Watson Institute for a book signing and reception. But please join me in thanking Ed and Mark for our conversation.